So welcome everyone who is here so far and welcome to those who are just joining. This is the Wildlife and Fire in the Southwest webinar series. Today, this is our fourth webinar in this series, and we are focusing on understanding landscape scale impacts and conservation through a single species lens. I am very excited to welcome all of you and our panelists today for what is definitely going to be a very interesting, very engaging session. We will be covering a very broad range of topics today. I'm Lexi Newkirch. I work for the Rocky Mountain Research Station as a science delivery specialist, and I am based in Fort Collins, Colorado. After my short intro today, we're going to hear presentations and stories from our panelists, followed by a very robust panel discussion and a Q&A with all of you. So this Wildlife and Fire in the Southwest workshop and webinar series has been created by a very large team of partners, including the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, Southwest Fire Science Consortium, USDA Forest Service Region 3 and Rocky Mountain Research Station, US Fish and Wildlife Service, and all of the agencies and groups whose logos are listed on the screen here. This group created this year-long series of workshops, webinars, and reports to improve wildlife outcomes in the face of fire. The series is intended to help researchers and practitioners across disciplines of wildlife and fire to exchange ideas, tools, lessons for working within the rapid pace and scale of fire management, specifically in the Southwest. Each of the webinars in this series focuses on a topic identified by our 200 virtual workshop participants as something that they wanted to hear more about and discuss in greater detail during their workshop in January. If you were unable to attend that workshop, but you want to watch the presentations and discussions, I will put a link to that recording in the chat. We've already gathered some important questions from you as you registered that will guide the beginning of our discussion today once we get there. But if you have additional questions or comments at any time for our panelists while they are presenting, please put them into the chat and we will be taking care of them. A quick note. If you are a member of the media or with a congressional office, I ask that you please coordinate any information requests with the Rocky Mountain Research Station Public and Legislative Affairs Office. I will add that information into the chat for you if that applies. I also want to acknowledge and thank Rachel Bean and Gabe Kohler, who have been working behind the scenes on this webinar to keep us rolling super smoothly. You may see some notes from Gabe in the chat, but feel free to reach out if you have any technical issues. We are recording this webinar today, so if you'd like to watch the recording again or share it with a colleague who couldn't attend, it will be posted on the RMRS webinar page. I will also put that link in the chat for you as soon as I'm done with my intro. While we unfortunately do not have a translator today here in person, we will have Spanish captions available on the recording of this video on the Rocky Mountain Research Station webpage. So I am very excited to welcome our panelists today. We have Juan Carlos Bravo, an Associate Director for the Wildlands Network, Olivia Carroll, researcher, author, and teacher at the Santa Fe Girls School, Sarah Hoagland, National Program Lead for Tribal Research with the USDA Forest Service, and Dan Taylor, a Senior Restoration Specialist at Bat Conservation International. I'm looking forward to hearing from each of them and then getting into our panel discussion. I'm going to stop sharing my slides now, and then I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Juan Carlos. As an Associate Director of Wildlands Network, Juan Carlos advances a vision of a connected North America where nature and communities thrive, embracing biological and cultural diversity across diverse landscapes and jurisdictions. Born in Mexico City, Juan Carlos moved in 2005 to the border state of Sonora, where he played a central role in establishing, expanding, and managing the Northern Jaguar Reserve, a private sanctuary for the northernmost jaguar population. Throughout his career, he participated in reintroducing Mexican wolves into Mexico, successfully campaigned for securing the legal protection of the 200,000 hectare Avispe protected area, prevented the destruction of the best preserved stretch of the Cocospera River by negotiating the redirection of a highway, and played important roles in the passing of novel environmental state legislation. He advocates for international and multi-stakeholder collaboration and enjoys complex problems that call for solutions through diverse skill sets and multiple approaches. Juan Carlos is a 2021 recipient of Wilberforce's Conservation Leadership Award. All right, Juan Carlos, You can share your screen. I am currently not seeing it right now. And there we go. Looks great. You can take it away.
Thank you, Lexi. And thank you, everyone, for showing up here and taking interest in these issues. I'm going to talk about the changing landscapes of jaguars. And by changing, I mean a couple of things. A lot of people to this day assume that jaguars occur mostly in tropical landscapes. And it is important for us to make emphasis on the fact that jaguars are very, very adaptable to different kinds of landscapes, so long as there is abundant prey for them and that people leave them alone. Throughout most of western and northern Mexico, jaguars can be found in landscapes very much like this picture that are semi-arid to arid, either tropical deciduous forest or Sinaloan thorn scrub. This is a model that was created for the jaguar recovery plan of the Fish and Wildlife Service. It shows connectivity throughout western Mexico and into Arizona, what would be considered jaguar corridors. And as you can see here, this has a huge difference in latitude from the southern portions, where you can also note that there's a lot of jaguar habitat near the coast. And as it goes north towards Arizona, the jaguar habitat moves away from the coast and into more montane areas without going into higher elevation pine woodlands, as you can see in the Sierra Madre Occidental. This, interestingly enough, coincides significantly with fire occurrences in this map of 2023 throughout Mexico, and it's quite easy to see how these two kind of match up. And so it's definitely a good question trying to figure out what's going on with jaguars and fire across such a vast landscape. So in the south, we've got places like Marismas Nacionales, coastal mangroves that look very much like this. And jaguars are very well adapted to this kind of landscape. There's definitely incidences of jaguars moving about the water and enjoying it much more than we give cats credit for. This landscape is not supposed to burn, but it is actually burning. Every once in a while, these tropical, semi-tropical landscapes are burning, and it's caused by both people clearing up land for agriculture, and also, as a result of hurricanes coming in, bringing down a lot of trees that eventually dry up, and there's an accumulation of fuel. And so these landscapes are being affected by the increase in hurricane intensity and frequency brought about by climate change. And this is the kind of things that we see in these wetter landscapes. As they move north, jaguars will focus more on when they can't find mangroves or tropical deciduous forests. They'll prefer this kind of habitat in this slide, which is Sinaloan thorn scrub. And this thorn scrub is not just like mangroves and tropical deciduous forests, is not adapted to fire, but also is seeing a lot more fire frequency as a result of both climate change and the introduction of African grasses like buffalo grass to create pastures for raising cattle in that region. This is a picture of a jaguar from the Northern Jaguar Reserve, the core breeding area in the state of Sonora, and nearby this landscape has burned a few times in the last few years. It is still not an issue of major concern, but we can anticipate that prolonged periods of drought and the kind of management that brings about buffalo grass conversions is just going to create more of these incidences. And one of the things that's concerning is the impact this might have on prey species like deer that will try to avoid these open areas in these landscapes. As jaguars continue, expanding north, they are entering a habitat type that's different from Sinaloan thorn scrub and going into oak grasslands and pine oak woodlands, and they're even found in conifer forests in Arizona and Chihuahua. And these landscapes are much better adapted to fire, but jaguars seem to only be using them for the time being to look for areas in which they can establish a territory. And as far as we know, this only includes so far young males looking for new territories. Perhaps a few young females, not as far as Arizona, but certainly as far as northern Sonora. And this landscape, while it is adapted to fire, it is, like I said, it reaches higher elevation mountains with pine or woodlands. This is a picture from jaguars up north in Arizona, and an interesting one in that because it is one of the few pictures of jaguars in snow, that at least the only one I can think of right now. There may be others. But this landscape has been seeing, of course, some very intense fires in the past. And in the case of Chihuahua, one of the interesting things is that oftentimes it's assumed that the firefighting efforts in northern Mexico have not been as successful or as intense, particularly in the 20th century, as they were in the US. And so there's an assumption that there was more of a natural regime to fire in higher elevation forests of Mexico. And more recently, without spoiling any of their work, a team at the USGS is finding that's probably not necessarily the case homogeneously throughout the Sierra Madre Occidental. And some places have definitely seen periods of over 30 years without significant fire, meaning a lot of accumulation of fuel and presumably more intense fires when they eventually happen. And so what we're seeing across the landscape, what I want to the message that I want to get across mostly is that there's not going to be a single strategy that works for fire management for something that we could call jaguar habitat, because jaguar habitat is going to look significantly different depending on what habitat is available to jaguars. And so in the southernmost extreme of what the northern population of jaguars includes, we're going to have to adapt to climate change in the sense of preparing potentially crews to recover fuel after massive hurricanes. There is a lot of work to be done with small agricultural managers in terms of use of fire and controlling fires within their properties so that they don't expand into mangrove and tropical deciduous forest. And as we go farther north, the question is, how much will this impact Sinaloa and thorn scrub? And how much of the Sinaloa and thorn scrub has already been converted to buffalo pastures, or how much is still being converted, which is an issue that's still ongoing in Mexico, to fire-adapted grasslands that can precipitate large landscape-scale fires in an ecosystem that is definitely not adapted to fire. The question in the north, I don't think is going to be quite as pressing in Arizona and New Mexico, and to the east into Chihuahua, since those landscapes are well adapted to fire. But it's still important to consider that even particularly for the Sierra Madre Occidental, we still don't know a lot about the fire regime, about the condition of the forests there, and how much will jaguars use them if available. Our assumption so far is that jaguars have been expanding there because the areas are available and there aren't any dominating males or females that preclude younger animals from moving in. But we could be wrong. Maybe jaguars definitely don't appreciate this kind of habitat and they're only using it to move from A to B. So still a lot to know about jaguar habitat preferences in the northern extreme of their distribution. That is basically all I had. I might have gone a little bit quick, but maybe I give others a chance to expand on their presentations.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Juan Carlos. Very interesting, and it gives us plenty more time for our discussion to really get into some questions from the viewers here. All right,
Absolutely.
I'll have you stop sharing your screen and we will get ready to hear from Olivia Carroll. Olivia has been studying wild bees for over 25 years in environments throughout the Western United States. She works extensively with land managers to develop programs for monitoring wild bees on large landscapes, as well as studying the pollinators of rare plants in New Mexico. She is the author of 3 books on bees: The Bees in Your Backyard, The Common Bees of the Eastern U.S., and The Common Bees of the Western U.S. She lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where she also teaches middle school science at the Santa Fe Girls School. All right, I see your slides now, Olivia. Looks great. You can take it away. But I cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
That was weird. I think the best part of this for me is that I am going to learn so much from all of you. You guys know a lot more about jaguars and fun things like that than I do. So just a quick refresher, because lots of people, when they hear that I'm going to talk about bees, assume we're talking about honeybees. And so I just want to introduce you to wild bees, which are a little bit different. Both are important. Wild bees, I don't know what's happening here. I'm not in control. Let's see. How do I go back? There we go. Okay. Does that work? Okay. Wild bees live solitarily, meaning that there's no queen and workers or division of labor. It's all the bees kind of do all the things that need to be done. So each female gathers pollen, she builds a nest, she lays the eggs, she does everything. They're diverse. There's 3,500 to 4,000 species just in North America. They collect pollen actively. So they actually go out to flowers and grab pollen and bring it back to the nest, which makes them pretty efficient and effective pollinators and makes them important for consideration for landscape managers. And you can find many species sort of co-occurring together in an area, 20 to 50 species living on an acre altogether. In some ways, this is similar to sort of flowering plant communities, in that when you look out and you see, flowers growing in some area, it may be patchy. Many of them may come and go. They may be short-lived over the course of a season, and who and how many changes from year to year. So one year you may have tons of sunflowers blooming in your backyard, and the next year maybe not so many. And the same sort of thing is happening with bees. But the big difference is that the bees move. So they may come up in a year, and if that sunflower patch isn't there, they are free to head off to some other place and forage there instead and build their nests in that area. Kind of like birds, we call them central place foragers. So that means that each female, where she establishes her nest, from there, it says my screen sharing is paused. You guys are seeing my screen, right?
I am seeing it.
Okay, and it says the challenges of sampling bees on the top.
Oh, no, it's not. It does not. Let me see if I can help with that.
Okay, I don't know why it was working a minute ago. Let's try there. How's that?
Yep, now we're seeing the challenges of sampling bees.
That's weird. I don't know what happened there. That was fun. Okay. Hopefully this will work from here. So these bees can kind of move, and they set up sort of an area where they're going to set up their nests, and from there they forage out in directions from that place. So they're central in terms of the place where they are, and then they forage out from there, which creates some interesting dynamics and makes them not always in the same place from year to year. There are some additional challenges, which is that sort of because they move, but also for other reasons we can talk about, they tend to be variable across space and time. So we tend to find high populations in one area, and then that same species may be, just next door, across a road even, may not be in the same abundance, but then down the road it's abundant again. So there tends to be a lot of variability which can make it kind of tricky to sort of figure out who's in an area and to get a sense of bee populations over time because they're changing all the time. Okay, tell me if the slide changed. It did, right? We're good? Okay. There's an additional challenge, which is that you can't really tell what species you have until you have them back in a lab and they've been pinned and you're looking under a microscope because, you know, there's lots of species that are co-occurring in an area and many of them can look similar. And to give an example of that, I have pictures here of two bees. They're in the same genus, but they're different species. And the main difference is whether at the top of sort of the shouldery area, it's pointed or rounded. Obviously not something you can see in the field. So with the exception of like large bumblebees, it can be tricky to tell different species apart until you have a good sample of them back in the lab. So what is it that we really know so far about bee populations and bee communities? Obviously not as much as we want to know. This can be kind of a trick for us to figure out. Part of the problem, hold on, I don't know how that happens. This is strange. Part of the problem is that we haven't really been looking at bees in terms of populations and things until fairly recently. We do know, as I said, that worldwide there's 20,000 to 30,000 species and 3,500 or so in the US. And just to give you a sense of how that compares to other regions, east of the Mississippi River, there's about 770 bee species. And if we break that down according to states, you can get a sense for how the Western United States has most of the bees. And in fact, the Southwest tends to be the area where bee species richness sort of reaches its peak. We have a really long flowering season here. We have a lot of little niches, so plants will bloom for a short period of time and then another one blooms and then another, rather than long extended blooms, and this can lead to individual little niches for lots of bees over the course of a year. And we have really dry soils, and many of these bees are nesting in the ground, and so dry soils tend to be a good place for that. And we'll talk about that when we talk about fire here. So one of the main reasons that we monitor and manage for bees is because there's some concern that perhaps bee populations are in decline, and trying to figure that out is sort of what we're aiming to do. We don't know enough to say for sure whether bees are in decline for all but a handful of the species that we find in North America. This is the big challenge to try and figure out. We don't have much in the way of standardized data where we've gone out in an area and quantified each of the species in terms of how many individuals there are, and then watch to see how those change naturally over time so that we can then go back and say, oh, there's significantly less, there's a problem here, and compare it. Sort of broadly, we can look and there have been studies that have shown that habitat modification, landscape fragmentation, pesticide use, potentially climate change, especially at high elevation areas, and invasive plants are probably changing bee communities in pretty big ways. But again, quantifying that for each species, single species, has been challenging. One of the ways that people have tried to get some sense of what's going on with bees is to focus in on just one group. And often this is bombus, which is the bumblebees. They're big, they're easy to see. We can involve citizen scientists pretty easily. Or the other way to do it is to sort of hone in on one very small area and get to know that one area well. But combining, you know, understanding single species on large landscapes is definitely where a lot of time and effort has been placed for bee researchers recently. There will be, of course, winners and losers, and data suggests that if we start looking in at sort of single species, you know, ground nesting bees are going to be affected differently than bees that are nesting in twigs or nesting in pieces of wood. Bees that come out in the spring may be differently affected than bees that come out in the summer or in the fall. Specialist bees are going to be differently impacted compared to generalists. And so the real thing that we're trying to figure out is who is in which group so that we can focus in on which bees really need additional support and sort of figure that out. And this also can be applied to like areas and the way that habitats sort of get impacted. So which areas might be most affected? Obviously, today we're thinking about it a lot in terms of fire and how fire might impact bees. There isn't a ton of data that's out there on this yet, although that's growing, and there's a lot of really amazing efforts in Colorado, I think in particular, is doing a lot of stuff right now, and in a couple of years we'll see some really cool stuff out of that from a lot of grad students there. But it seems like in general, what we're finding is following a burn, there tends to be an abundance of floral resources, and that's bees follow those floral resources and tend to be more abundant after a fire than before, partly because the canopy is gone. You know, there's this nutrient release, there's lots of flowers and things like that. Obviously, those really hot fires that come through are more likely to impact ground nesting bees, which can survive sort of modest fires without any trouble in the ground. They're insulated enough that they survive. Twig nesters, of course, that's one of those which categories of bees will be impacted. They would be more so. And then two, considering what plants are coming back in these areas after a fire, invasive plants are going to change sort of the community and the pollinator networks and all of that afterwards. Similarly, and these things sort of tie together, we can talk about how bees respond to grazing. This is another big landscape level sort of change that can impact bees as it removes a lot of the floral resources that bees might need, or drought. And this is one I'm seeing because I live in northern New Mexico and we've had some pretty interesting droughts. This is the same plot one year and the next, and this picture is taken at the same time of year. What does drought do to the bees in these areas and how are they responding? So to figure this out, we spend a lot of time trying to gather baseline data. And of course, we argue about the best way to do it, what techniques to use with a creature that tends to be so variable and change so much. There is a big sort of national call to work on finding some way to monitor bees in a way that we can share data between states, between universities, between people who have different objectives with their projects. And I've been involved in a lot of those, which has been pretty fun for me to try and figure out. I love these questions. I'm really interested in trying to figure out what techniques we can use to best understand our bees and get into sort of the statistics behind it, but then also what's a practical strategy for doing this. I typically work in plots and try and do things in a really standardized way. And these plots, in one sense or another, have been done all over. Come on, slides. Very strange. All over the Western United States for several years now. So that's kind of exciting to see. Generally speaking, when I talk to land managers about how to monitor for bees, the first question that I end up asking is how much time people have. If you have just a little bit of time, even just some passive sampling can be really useful for figuring out who is in the area and giving us a sense for certain groups, at least, of how many of each of those are there. With a little more time or a little more effort, a little more interest, targeted collections on certain plant groups can be done. And then both of those can be combined if lots of time is available to do plot collections, which are really standardized, high quality, and usually completed over multiple years of returning to the same place. In all of this, the goal is to collect data for long-term monitoring. We really want to know over the next 20 or 40 years what's happening with bee populations in different areas. Hopefully, we're creating a baseline for future land managers to benefit from. We hope to determine the impacts of some things like drought, like climate change, like fire on large landscapes, and provide some sort of methodology that's standardized so that others can try this in other places. And I'll quit there. Sorry about my funky slides. I'm not sure how I did that, but hopefully that's enough to help you out.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Those were beautiful photos. I'm glad we got to see them all. That was so awesome. Next up, we are going to hear from Dr. Sarah Hoagland. Sarah Hoagland, Laguna Pueblo, works for the USDA Forest Service Research and Development Branch as the National Program Lead for Tribal Research. Sarah is actively involved with the Society of American Foresters, the Intertribal Timber Council, Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, as well as the Wildlife Society. Today, she'll primarily discuss her long-term research on the Mexican spotted owl. All right, I'll hand it over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Lexi. And yeah, just wanted to extend a note of appreciation for the coordinators and Lexi for gathering this group. Love Juan's talk on the jaguars. They're so charismatic, but I'll just say with the pollinators and the owls and Dan coming up with bats, the winged creatures might be taking over. So yeah, I actually decided not to go with slides today for two reasons. One, man, just the technological hiccups that are possible. I don't know if I just have bad luck or what, but secondly, a lot of the work that I'll be sharing is primarily based on addressing the needs of the tribal community that I work with. And so the results and things like that really go directly to the tribe, and then it's up to that sovereign nation to decide if they want to share their results. So some of the stuff has been published, and I'll have Lexi provide some links to the resources here in a little bit, but for the most part, you know, the data is really housed with the tribal community. So for today, I'm going to speak mainly about a case study with the Mexican spotted owl and the partnership that we've developed with the Mescalero Apache tribe, and kind of talk a little bit about a story related to this species. So again, just really happy to be here today, and apologies for not having visuals, but really thrilled to present some of this work to you all. So just a quick note too about my current position. So Lexi mentioned I'm the national program lead for tribal research with the Forest Service Research and Development Branch. I used to be in the Rocky Mountain Research Station and was able to sort of pursue this work, you know, nearly full time. But now that I'm in a national position, I'm really more assisting with helping the Forest Service develop policy and guidelines on how we can build relationships with tribal communities, and sort of overseeing what we're doing at all of our various research stations. So it saddens me a little bit to drift from this research, but some of the work we've continued on is through partnering with various organizations like the Wildlife Society to hire on some of those tribal or native assistants to continue this work. So just wanted to point out a note for that. So I'm mainly going to provide a little bit of background on the Mexican spotted owl, just providing some life history traits and some information on their current threats, which is wildfire. I'm going to provide some history of our research project and kind of how we got to the phase where we are today with achieving research approvals and things like that. And then I have a series of research questions that we're addressing that the tribe is very interested in to help with their management goals. And then end with sort of a story with what recently happened this past summer with the salt fire in this particular landscape. So with that, yeah, just starting with some background on the Mexican spotted owl. This is a forest dwelling species. It also can dwell in canyons and caves throughout parts of its range. It's primarily distributed throughout the Southwest and the Four Corners region, but its habitat does extend and populations throughout Mexico as well. It's listed currently as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act since 1993. The first recovery plan came out around that time, and then a second revision came out in 2012 when I started my dissertation work on the species. It inhabits late seral forested communities or late seral forested stands with a lot of high horizontal and vertical structural diversity, lots of snags, lots of coarse woody debris, occupying real steep slopes, kind of northeast facing areas for their nesting habitat. Their prey base, at least in our study site, is primarily small mammals. But we've even seen them catch things like bats, sorry, Dan, and rabbits, other bird species, but primarily small mammals. You know, a lot of the main threats when the species was currently listed in 1993 were based off of lack of forest management protections to sort of secure and conserve their nesting habitat, recognizing that they do inhabit places that are often commercial, highly valuable timber stands. So that was sort of the first main threat there when the species was listed. And then more recently in 2012, with the new revision of the recovery plan, wildfire is more often cited as a threat to the species. And we've seen that just north of our study site. We've seen it throughout the range of the species in those real high severity stand replacing wildfire, where a lot of the canopy cover is eliminated or severely reduced, so that the bird doesn't have that same sort of cover to provide nesting and roosting habitat. So that's sort of a background on the species. They're really fascinating to study. Really, like it never gets old seeing them out there in the forest. And for those of you who have had the honor and pleasure of studying them, I have no doubt you agree. As far as the history of our project goes, really this was driven by the tribe's needs and interest in understanding the range of habitat conditions that the owl would occupy. And I put that in quotes because that was actually directly what the tribe wrote in a tribal resolution, which is like their equivalent of a legally binding contract or document for the tribal government, where the tribe really wanted to understand the range of the habitat conditions that the species would occupy. So we went through a whole series of approvals and relationship building to launch in this research project. And we've been there, like I said, since 2012, so about 13 years now. And the various research questions, again, primarily management driven, that we're answering. The first one I'll talk about is looking at habitat suitability of the species. And I've asked Lexi to put a link to this publication in the chat, so she'll do that here in a second. But basically what we did is using remote sensing and satellite imagery to characterize the composition of owl habitat on tribal lands compared to the adjacent non-tribal lands. And we used a series of sort of habitat suitability and modeling to sort of understand those conditions. And what we found is that the habitat on tribal lands was different compared to the adjacent non-tribal lands. And that was primarily due to the tribe's owl sites were essentially 1,000 feet lower in elevation. So those compositions were more Douglas fir rather than white fir on the adjacent ownerships. And that work has really assisted the tribe moving forward, just as far as identifying priority areas to survey and or to put additional investments for monitoring. So that habitat suitability work has been completed and is out there in the literature. The second research project I'd like to talk about is looking at the forest vegetation. So going from sort of the 30,000 foot view to more of the stand level type stuff. And so what we did was collect stand exam data around owl nesting sites to characterize things like basal area, total volume, canopy cover, the percent composition of trees in various size classes. We did some coarse woody debris and fuels transects, so getting more of that stand level information on what the nesting and roosting habitat looks like. Another research project we've been doing and just continuing per request from the tribe is monitoring occupancy and reproduction of their spotted owl sites. So not only looking at historical nesting sites, but then also doing inventory in new areas where owls might be dispersing to. That occupancy and reproduction work does take significant survey effort and time. And so I'll just recognize the landscape that the tribe owns and the amount of sites to monitor is quite daunting. But that's also the exciting part of the work. And so we're continuing with that. Another research project we're continuing is looking at, so we went from sort of the remote sensing level to the stand level, and then now we're also looking at things like nest tree structures. And so for the past decade, we've been collecting various attributes such as the total DBH of the nest tree, the number of potential nest trees within a 50-meter radius of that current nest site. We look at things like cut stumps around the nest tree. So that can be some sort of indicator of past management practices that have gone on. We look at things like if the nest structure itself is viewable to overhead predators, such as, red-tailed hawks or goshawks and things like that. We also take, nice photos of that stand to just sort of see what it looks like visually. But that nest tree data set I think is helpful. And I'll just explain one, recent use of that data set is the tribe also, like many of our southwestern forests, has a pretty decent population of dwarf mistletoe infection rates. And what we noted in our data set so far is that 55% of the spotted owl nest sites are within these dwarf mistletoe brooms or root like rest clumps sort of. So just as far as characterizing the landscape and characterizing these resources that the birds are using, I think it's helpful for management. Another research project we've done in the past was looking at the prey base. And this was actually as part of a CFLRP project. Those of you in the Southwest probably remember that acronym. Working to look at, total prey abundance, looking at densities, diversity, and that project will be an appendix and supplemental material for the tribe's upcoming tribal wildlife management plan. So that small mammal data set is something that's useful for many reasons, not only understanding the prey for the species, but then also the tribe moving forward and looking at other small mammal prey base on their lands. Another research project that we just started with a native grad student is looking into the use of the acoustic recording devices. So we're using the mini song meters from Wildlife Acoustics, and we've deployed those in 25 hexagons throughout the reservation that are within spotted owl suitable habitat, and looking at just basic elements and testing sort of the efficiency and effectiveness of these devices. And what the grad student has been finding so far is that, yeah, we certainly can detect owls using these devices. You can also gather all kinds of other, bird species data with the recordings that, you can get species lists and all kinds of exciting results from that. And one thing that we're really kind of honing in on in his model recently, and not to be the spoiler alert like Juan did with his talk, but there is some interesting relationship between great horned owl vocalization rates and what we're getting for Mexican spotted owl. So that one coming in the future soon once the grad student finishes. Two more little research projects I'll play with here, and then I'll hand it off to our next speaker. But getting back to the theme of this presentation, looking at fire. So two things related to that. One, looking at, the use of prescribed fire. And so part of that CFLRP project, we were able to implement some burns within owl habitat. There hasn't been enough resources and funding to do significant, follow up on that and monitoring. But I think that's something that the tribe is beginning to, gain more interest and more possible resources to look into that further. So looking at prescribed fire, but then also wildfire risks. So going back to some of that stand level data that I had mentioned, I had past worked at the fire lab here in Missoula, Montana, where we have all kinds of great, modeling tools where we can input that stand level data and look at the risk of like crown fire based off of various conditions. And so we'd really like to continue to pursue that, because I think that that's one question that really remains and is of interest in this particular landscape. Lexi, I see you coming on, so I will finish up here and I'll just wrap up with this quick story with the salt fire. Really, I think it's a great story just as far as coordination goes. Many of you are probably aware of the salt fire and then the South Fork fire that broke out there near the town of Ruidoso this summer. But essentially what we did was really coordinate with that incident command team and help reroute some resources to ensure that the owl sites and the current nesting locations were protected. So we came up and worked collaboratively with where we came up with a great alternative. So I'll just end by mentioning, I think tribal forests in general are places that we can really learn from as far as models for land stewardship. So I've asked Lexi to put in a link to a report called IFMAT, which is a project I worked on for the last 2 years, looking at just assessing tribal forests and forest management in the United States. So if any of you are more interested in learning about how tribes are managing their forests, you can look at that resource. And if you're interested more in like how tribes are managing their wildlife resources, we did just publish this new volume on tribal wildlife stewardship. Of course, it's not coming in on the screen, partnering with the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society to produce this contributed volume. There's beautiful artwork in here too, and poems, and then also a lot of technical wildlife pieces. So with that, thank you. Excuse me for going over a little long, but really looking forward to the discussion later.
Thank you. All fascinating to hear about. Hoping to get into more of those things in the discussion with you. All right, our next and final presentation before our discussion time will be from Dan Taylor. Dan is a senior restoration specialist with Bat Conservation International, where he has worked for 25 years directing programs on the management of bats and abandoned mines, bats in forests, and bats and water. Dan was previously a biologist on the Kootenai, Mount Hood, and Prescott National Forests. He received his BS in wildlife biology from the University of Montana and his MS in forestry from Northern Arizona University. All right, Dan, I am seeing your slides.
I think I'll go.
Looking good.
Am I unmuted?
Yep.
Okay, I'll go ahead and just use the share screen. So you're seeing them okay?
I am seeing them great.
Great.
Take it away.
Okay. Yeah, thanks everybody for being here today with great presentations. All right, so since a lot of you are foresters and ecologists, a quick background on bats, 1,400 plus species, the second most diverse order of mammals on the planet. There are about 47 species in the US and Canada, and more than half of those are found in Arizona and New Mexico. All but 3 of those 28 species are insectivores. This is an important conservation thing that a lot of people aren't aware of. They're very long-lived, one of the longest-lived mammals for their size, and slow reproducing. So they average 1 pup per year, and the record is about 45 years. And whoops, okay, I'm getting a message. There we go. Though that's an eastern bat, probably in the Southwest, maybe 10 to 20 years. And ecosystem services, there's been some really good research out of Boston University showing that they save foresters and farmers about $4 billion a year in pest control services. And all around the world, they pollinate and disperse the seeds of many really valuable ecological plants, economical and ecological. Right now, let's see if I can get it to. Okay, now for some reason I'm not going to the next screen. Here, there we go. So, what are the main threats to bats in the U.S. and Canada? Wind power is killing 200 to 400,000 bats per year. We are making progress working with other organizations, the federal government, and wind industry to come up with mitigation strategies. And it's mostly migrating bats that are being killed by turbines. White nose syndrome, I imagine most of you heard about this. It's a disease that's caused from an introduced fungus. It's killed more than 7 million bats. These are primarily affecting eastern species that hibernate in very large aggregations, but unfortunately, it's now in the Southwest as well. And the fungus Pseudosugo destructans has been detected in Arizona, and the actual disease, white nose syndrome, has been detected in New Mexico. But in the Southwest, drought and reduced surface water are a primary threat to Southwest bat populations. Reproductive individuals must drink every night, and they can lose up to 30% of their body weight to evaporative water loss in a 24-hour period. So as springs, as stock ponds, as other water sources dry up, there's definitely going to be a fairly large effect landscape-wise, region-wise on bat populations. So bats, fires, and watershed restoration, forest and roosting habitat. Most bat species rely on forests to some extent, and they provide critical resources for roosting, foraging, and drinking. 4 of the species in the Southwest are tree roosting obligates, all foliage roosting, while another 12 use tree roost frequently, snags, and both for bachelor colonies and maternity roosts. So really, bat conservation in forest is pretty much about snags. Large mid to late decay class snags, stage 3 and 4, especially in clumps, because there's a lot of roost switching among maternity colonies. They're the most important. They're often the largest snags in the stand. They roost under the sloughing bark, in cavities, lightning strike crevices. That ponderosa pine there on the left, there were 400 long-legged myotis under a 2-foot by 2-foot piece of bark. And all the way to the right, that ponderosa pine, or maybe it's I'm not sure which kind of tree it is actually, but there were 35 pallid bats, a maternity colony in a cavity there, roosting in that knot. And of the foliage roosting bats, deciduous and riparian canopy trees are often the most important in the riparian corridor. So in terms of foraging habitat, certainly in the Southwest, riparian areas are by far the most important foraging habitat. Makes sense due to the production of invertebrate biomass on that vegetation along the riparian, as you can see, compared to upland. That's such as forest, woodlands, shrubs, shrublands, grasslands, they are all important foraging habitat as well. For forest stands, there's a guild that can forage under the canopy in denser vegetation. These have light wing loading. This Mexican free-tailed boat at the top right, long, narrow wings, relatively heavy body size. They're not very maneuverable. They're going to forage over the canopy, along forest roads, along edge, and in forest clearings. The guild that has broader, lighter wing loading, like these myotis bats, bottom right, broader wing, lighter body, they can forage under the canopy. They can be gleaners. And so, you know, the effects of forest management and fire are going to have a relation to some of the maneuverability, the flight morphology of these bats. But it's a gradient. It's not kind of a 0-1 thing. There's just some bats that are a lot less maneuverable and some that are quite a bit more maneuverable. All right, so fire. How does fire affect bats? That picture, by the way, is the black fire, 350,000 acres. It was in 2022. So the direct effects, of course, would be displacement, but bats are volant. However, mortality is certainly possible, especially non-volant young, which are going to be in trees, under bark, probably in May, June, when some of these big fires are occurring. The biggest long-term thing would be the loss of snag roosts. And, you know, it will create a lot of snags, of course, some of these fires, but it takes a really long time for the new large trees that grow after, you know, to come in after fire generations to become snags. The indirect effects would be sedimentation and debris flows affecting riparian habitats and a temporary reduction in insect biomass and foraging habitat quality. However, in a review of 23 studies of effects of wildfire on bats, Loeb and Blakey identified a greater proportion of negative responses to wildfire and a neutral or positive response to prescribed fire. And I should add that there's really actually been very little research done relative to a lot of other vertebrate organisms on forest management and fire on bats. It's just very difficult species to study. But that response really is going to vary depending on severity, extent, proximity to unburned vegetation, what they call biodiversity, burn heterogeneity, again, the species and the guilds, and the mobility of the species. So there's a lot of factors. But in terms of prescribed fire, certainly the negative would just be temporary displacement and a temporary decrease in invertebrate prey or foraging quality and the possible loss of snags. The positive, a lot like the bees, of course, there's a reduced probability of high severity forest fires. So you're putting that off. And then you're increasing in below canopy foraging space for those bats that forage under the canopy. You're going to increase in herbaceous understory cover, which should equal an increase in biomass of invertebrate prey. And then overall, a better watershed condition. So therefore, basically better riparian health and then biomass, invertebrate biomass. And you can see with, the dog hair stand, it's going to be really hard for any bat species to fly through. And then post thinning and prescribed fire, a lot more open of a stand. Now, thinning and mechanical treatments would be pretty similar to the above prescribed fire, but probably not the same type of understory or herbaceous response. Okay, so how about watershed restoration, looking at the bottom of the watershed? Well, certainly, as I mentioned with prescribed fire and other forest restoration treatments, you're going to have an increase in upland foraging habitat, an increase in riparian foraging habitat by promoting riparian health. Another thing, bats have to drink while they're in flight. So they can only drink from pooled water, not fast moving water. So, slowing down the velocity of the water, we have an increase in quantity and availability of pooled water. And then, of course, an increase in roosting habitat for some of those foliage roosting bats in that riparian canopy, especially cottonwoods, alder, sycamore. And our restoration efforts in the Blackfire over the last 3 years have focused on moving natural recovery along by using low-tech, process-based, and natural channel design techniques, including planting riparian vegetation such as willows and cottonwoods, constructing in-stream structures with local materials to slow the stream velocity, or reconnect it to the floodplain, and increase pooled water availability for bats, Gila trout, and of course, a myriad of other invertebrate wildlife species that depend on riparian areas. So monitoring wise, it's pretty straightforward for us. We're using acoustic monitoring devices. This is Wildlife Acoustics SM4 for multiple days during the warmest, driest time of the year when bats are most active at our sites. As many pre-implementation time as we can get, but at least a season or two if possible. And then, of course, after restoration, for hopefully more than one season for post-restoration. And we can look at changes in bat activity levels using those acoustics. And then the other stuff is pretty standard, percent survival of riparian plantings and changes in canopy cover and water temperature. And the water temperature, again, in this case, on the Gila National Forest in this Blackfire scar is for Gila trout. All right, so summary and management recommendations. In general, prescribed fire has a neutral or positive effect on bat populations, whereas wildfire can have negative effects. So continue to keep implementing forest restoration actions that reduce the probability of high severity burns. Avoid cutting large snags, including under fuelwood cutting permits. So if it's a salvage area or if you're prescribed burning, rake the duff away or spray retardant at the base of large snags before prescribed burning. Do not burn up the snags. That's probably the most important thing that you can do. And avoid or reduce salvage logging in low severity burn areas. One of the things that came out of a study that will be published by Carol Chambers in Journal of Wildlife Management on the Wallow Fire. So it's probably the only long-term study of bat response to wildfire severity, low, medium, and high severity, was that these low severity burn areas had the highest diversity. Several studies have shown overall in those high severity fires, crown fires, that species richness and diversity has dropped and has stayed low for several years after those fires. And that is it. I only get to show this cartoon to non-bat people because the bat people have seen it many times. I kind of blaze through that, but there'll be hopefully plenty of time for additional questions and discussion. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan. That is hilarious. That was a great overview of all of your bat research, and I cannot wait to get into it a little bit more in these discussion questions that we have coming up. So I'll have you stop sharing your screen, Dan, and I will invite all of the other panelists to turn their cameras back on. We do have a chat going, and we have plenty of space and time here in the next 30 minutes for anyone who wants to put questions into the chat We will have time to get to most of those, as many of those as we possibly can. So pop those into the chat as you are thinking of them, and then we will also start with some of those questions that we had from your registration. I've shared a couple of links from each of our presenters in the chat too, so take a look at those if you haven't already. All right, I'm seeing all of you. Awesome, looks great. So I want to start us off with a kind of a broad question, but it's kind of pointing out that the most obvious differences between all of your presentations today are the scales of these landscapes and these projects that you're working on, from the bees to all the way up to jaguar, costing massive amounts of land. So in your experience, how have you had success in finding common ground with those who are working at the other end of the scale or who have different priorities than you when you're focused on your single species? I will open it up. Anyone is free to jump in first. It's a big question.
I can take a stab. I think for jaguars, it serves us well to look at the vast landscape in terms of population viability, population resilience over the long term. But ultimately, some of the most effective interventions have been at the local landscape. That I know of, the establishment of the Northern Jaguar Reserve, which is around 20,000 hectares, and the collaboration with the ranchers around it. That is all a very, very specific landscape in which you have the opportunity to build relations to expand the conversation beyond a single species. So again, being aware of the whole picture across a vast landscape, such as Western Mexico, Northwest Mexico, and into the Southwest US is helpful, but you can't realistically change things on the ground at that scale. You have to do it at more discrete landscapes and connect with others that are hopefully doing similar work in other places and sharing that large landscape vision. I hope this addresses the question.
I can chime in just from the opposite and the bee point of view, which is kind of small, but then we're trying to figure it out on a big landscape. And I don't have a good answer for this just because I don't often have opportunities to interact with people who are studying bats and jaguars and owls and things that I wish I did, because I think the best thing that can come from talking to people on the other side is that we're all still studying biology. It's all biological stuff. And the number of times that I have benefited in sort of designing a good monitoring program from understanding like how a vegetation ecologist studies something, or how a bird person who also is studying, oh my gosh, they're both central place foragers, understanding how the biologies are shared can really inform as we develop new techniques for something that's kind of new. We haven't done a ton of bee research until, the last couple decades. And so the communication, I think, can really help us grow this field, I guess.
I might add to that too, in the value of communication. I think some of this, and your question is talking about, large scales or working across different scales, is I think also trying to come to a point of shared goals. And I think that's a lot of what the tribe is starting to look at with their partners across the fence line. And I think it really comes down to communication and learning what are those different needs at those different scales. And I think we're at a phase 2 where there's just immense support for collaboration and like cross-boundary type partnerships. And in the landscape I study, I mean, they're bounded on both sides, to the north and to the south. So it's like a must, right? They have to collaborate across the fence. So yeah, not only communication, but just like coming to a point of understanding and figuring out those common goals, I think.
Thank you so much. So
I'll just mention that, we mostly on our restoration work have been working on national forest lands and pure land management lands. So we kind of tier to their landscape level, whether it be watershed condition framework and such, but we're certainly operating at a more local scale, in terms of riparian. But we do work with because bats don't make they don't choose between they don't avoid livestock water developments, and natural water development. So we work pretty closely with ranchers and livestock operators on improving water access for wildlife, spring protection, riparian management. But that just takes being out there for a long time, knowing how to talk to people and how to come up with solutions to, fence a spring and put the water outside for the cows, make a riparian pasture and instead of letting the cows hang out there for 365 days a year. And then our agave program in the US is it's very different than the part of the program, agave restoration. In Mexico, we work with ejidos and local communities and take kind of an overall One Health. It's not just getting the agaves back in the ground for the pollinating bats, but it's helping the communities start a vivero and for food plants and they can sell. So it's different depending on where you're at and who you're working with, of course, private versus federal.
And interestingly enough, I'd say that we're looking into expanding our catwork wildlands network to include ocelots, and a lot of the strategies for ocelots that also have a huge range of distribution that somewhat parallels jaguars in that they're also gradually coming back into Arizona. A lot of that strategy is protecting precisely the water sources that are shared with ranchers and managing them in such a way that it'll be useful for ocelots, bats, and other wildlife, while also providing for the ranchers in those communities. So it's interesting. I think there's a lot more in common than we think.
Yep.
absolutely. And you've all mentioned water in this discussion and in your presentations as well. So how can thinking about water help managers think about the scenic species and also the entire landscape, and how can it help them make decisions, perhaps?
But the core of almost all of this, obviously, in terms of restoration, water seems to be kind of a vegetation and water unifying. And as Juan Carlos mentioned, for us, fortunately, riparian habitat, there's people been working for years, whether it be for willow flycatcher, for cuckoos, for frogs, for fish. So and it's been recognized as important for a long time. So that helps. But the water in the Southwest is probably I would say roost and cave and mine, tree roost is not what's limiting bat populations. I think it's water availability in the Southwest. And the climate models show the IPCC models show the Southwest really increasing in temperature and aridity, and a pretty significant drop in surface water. So things that you can do to maintain water on the landscape, obviously it's going to help the wildlife that Juan Carlos is talking about. And one other thing about water was in the fires, in these that wallow fire, one of the things that may have caused some of the response of reduced diversity was increased solarization and water sites drying up, stock ponds drying up post-fire. So it may not have been the effect of the forest structure on the bat community, but actually it was confused by the lack of water sites.
So these species are also moving across the landscape, or it's uncertain whether they're in certain landscapes as far as bees knowing where they are. What do managers need to be thinking about when these species may or may not be in the area before a fire? And Sarah, you mentioned your story with the salt fire. Forgive me if I'm missing part of that name. And like, what did you do before to make that happen successfully? And what would you do again if you were in that same situation?
Yeah, I think luckily we had good relationships before the fire broke out. Obviously that's an emergency situation and you just have to play hour by hour as that happens. And so I think the thing that worked for us is we had, already, those very clear relationships with the DRNP, which is the tribe's natural resource department. They had the latest data sets. They knew like exactly what might be in the path of the fire. We also had really good networks and contacts with the adjacent Forest Service district staff who ended up serving as the local reads on that fire as the resource advisors. And so luckily those communication lines were already set and the network was ready so that, the phone could just be picked up and we could quickly talk through scenarios. But as far as what we would do different, I think the tribe is at a point where they have compacted and contracted all their forest management and their wildlife programs, which is really significant. So no longer BIA is not necessarily in the situation for them, but they're at the point building those management plans and I think better understanding like trigger points and maybe contingency plans pre-fire season, I think would have served us all well. And so I think they're at the point with they're trying to develop those resources. Thanks for that question.
Absolutely. Olivia or Juan, do you have anything to add as far as what to do before a fire in terms of with your species?
Nope. but I will say this. So I've been working outside of Dillon, Montana with a wildlife biologist who's really excited to sort of set up some monitoring as she has time and capacity, depending on, what field biologist she has that year and what's going on. And what's really cool is that at least for the prescribed fires, they have a plan that's like 5-10 years out even where they've got to monitor for owls and archaecytes and all of these things beforehand. And because they have this, it's easy to overlay bee monitoring on top of that to build in baseline data that then we can look at after the fire, 1 year after, 5-10 years after, and sort of start to gather information about what bees do pre and post fire. And I think that's pretty interesting. Especially because they also happen to know the scale of each of those burns and but depending on the season they're going to do it, we can figure out something about intensity and what sort of effects will happen. And I just think the way that prescribed fires are naturally set up, it's pretty cool to think about how we could take advantage of the information that's already out there to learn more about bees.
In terms of jaguars, I think the greater question is how do we make landscapes resilient enough to fire that they'll rebound after a fire incident? Because as I mentioned, much of the core habitat where jaguars are currently reproducing, it's not fire adapted. And so the larger question is, will we be able to keep it devoid of fire in the context of climate change? And if that's not the case, then how do we make it at least that it can rebound and it can continue to sustain a healthy prey base for larger carnivores? It becomes a bit more of a question in say, for example, in jaguars in Arizona, if there's going to be controlled burns in forest ecosystems that are starting to be recolonized by jaguars. I think with only 1 or 2 jaguars in Arizona currently, it's not yet a huge question. But I think the intensity of that conversation will rise a few notches once there's a female on the landscape. And if it happens to coincide in an area where somebody intends to do some kind of control burn, that's when it's going to get real tricky, because there's really no way to shoo her away or any of that. Mostly it'll go down to monitoring such an animal and trying to time your fire so that it doesn't impact them.
Thank you. So Sarah, you mentioned coming up with shared goals is very important when you're collaborating on the landscape. What, for each of your species, are your long-term goals with your particular focal species in the context of the changing climate?
I can go first. Long-term goals, man, right now I think the big problem is that we know so little about bee populations beyond bumblebees and sort of general. This area probably has a lot of bees and this has not so many, but we don't know who those bees are. I'm excited over the next 20 years or 30 years to see the baseline level of information and understanding about bees, especially in Western landscapes, grow as interest and funding and taxonomists and all of these things come on board. I think there's potential for a much greater understanding and an ability to answer some of these questions we're desperate to have answers to. You know, what's going to happen with climate change and bees in some of these areas, or what's going to happen with more really large fires. Well, it'd be great to know what bees are there beforehand, before the large fires happen, so that we can compare. So very basically, a lot more information at the species level for the 3,500 species that occur in these landscapes.
Go ahead, Dan. You had something to add?
Just this is more on the continental level. We did map Rachel Blakey at UCLA Pomona headed up a paper for us. That several people were on the paper. But anyway, it looked at climate change and bat distribution. And one of the things it did is it identified, as communities in the Western Mountains are going to move up in elevation and north, that has showed up for birds as well. But we also identified large areas of climate refuge where there'll be less species turnover and greater species diversity. And those can be overlaid, if they're not already, with protected areas. And those areas can be both a focus for monitoring to see if the predictions on movement, but also for management, for forest restoration, for water availability, and things that we can manipulate in those areas so that we can start looking out towards the future for what we're going to need to do, especially as things start burning up at the lower elevations. And the citation is in the chat.
Thank you. Sarah or Juan
Yeah,
Carlos?
I'd love to mention, so the long-term goals for my project and the species and the site that we're studying this, really it's gonna be about understanding the effects of forest treatments and fuel reduction projects on the Mexican spotted owl. We have some of that data growing in our information and what we've collected for the past 13 years, but I think it's going to take a significant data set to really understand that fully and different ways of looking at it. So, and really the goal then would be to figure out a way to balance wildfire risk with still providing habitat needs for the species. And so that will take significant time and effort. So that's a long-term goal. But another long-term goal I have is all about recruiting the next generation of people to help, right, in the field. Like, boy, it is hard to get folks, trained and up and going, but we all can only hike these areas for so long, right? But I think part of the long-term goal is about enticing folks into the careers of natural resources in general. And so I'm really pleased and looking forward to attending the Wildlife Society. I mean, there's just like great spots and locations to sort of recruit that next generation, but I think long-term about capacity, right? And making sure that we have enough people, boots on the ground to gather the data that we need. And just a kudos to Olivia, because she teaches at the Science Girls School. I mean, what a, really important and, big responsibility there, but it's critical.
Second that.
Yeah. So long term, our organization is focusing on identifying and protecting stepping stones corridors for jaguars from where they're breeding, particularly north towards the U.S.-Mexico border. We want to support recovery efforts in the U.S. that are taking different forms. There are, of course, huge obstacles with not just metaphorically speaking, but just the border wall being probably the largest one for recovery in the U.S. But it has to be said, having that monstrosity there, it basically sends a huge signal, that about what being neighboring countries is and what a relationship to each other is. And so that is a political landscape that is tainted by a physical barrier and makes international collaboration much harder. So, I think there is definitely a lot of room for the conservation community to advance an understanding that there's no protecting of large landscapes without acknowledging the cultural differences of all the peoples throughout those landscapes, whether they're indigenous peoples that have been, robbed of some of their land and are still dealing with that in the present, whether it's the urban rural cultural divide that exists in all the countries of North America, or whether it's Mexico US politics and how those play out. I think regrettably, that has been a lot in the news on the U.S. side lately. A whole sense of that anything foreign is bad and should be regarded with distrust and it's inferior and so on. Those sort of narratives are certainly not conducive to large landscape conservation. And the sort of protections that we need to provide for species that definitely do not recognize borders and do not recognize the difference in land tenure or management that we've imagined and placed on maps, but that don't necessarily exist on the landscape. So there is, along with the work on the landscape of protecting these corridors through a lot of private landowner engagement, there is a lot of work to do on the political landscape to change those narratives.
Thank you for sharing. We have a couple rapid fire questions for you, Olivia, from the chat. If you're ready for some bees. All right. How can a novice tell the difference between a bee predator, i.e. a wasp, and a native bee?
Let me come in the field with you and I will show you. It can be tricky to tell them apart because technically bees are wasps. They are the wasps that evolved to eat pollen instead of meat. And so they're close relatives and tend to look very similar to each other. I think flies are a little easier to tell apart than bees and wasps from each other. But that said, because they have such different sort of natural histories, there are some hints that you can look for. In your mind right now, I'm putting on my middle school teacher cap to tell you this. Imagine an Olympic swimmer. It's Michael Phelps or whoever else did really well this year. And he's standing up there and he's got like his hat on and the really broad shoulders and then like the really narrow waist, super long legs and no hair on his body anywhere. That is a wasp. So wasps tend to be hairless. They tend to have really narrow waist and really long, slender legs, often with lots of little spines on them, all of which is to help them be good predators and catch whatever it is, whether it's a spider, grasshoppers, katydids, bees, whatever they're doing. Whereas bees tend to be fluffy. Not always. There are exceptions, but they tend to be super fluffy and they tend to fly much faster because they're not hunting. They're like The goal is to get into the flower, get as much pollen, move on to the next flower, get as much pollen as quickly as possible, because that's fitness. Each pollen grain is tied to the success of offspring. So they're much more efficient and quick on flowers compared to wasps, which are, they're behaving more like a red-tailed hawk or an owl, perhaps. I don't know. Something where they're hunting their predators and they're out kind of moving leisurely around. So that's something you can look for. And then just sort of you get this gestalt feel for it after a while. So there's my short answer. Was it short? Shortish.
It was perfect. Thank you. And the next one is silviculture and fuels programs tend to use herbicides when reducing weeding fuels. Is there a universal list or suggested clave of herbicides wildlife managers should be aware of when consulted on the use of pesticides? Is there an alternative cost-effective method for invasive plant control?
If there's a list of herbicides, I'm not aware of it. Generally speaking, the problem with herbicides is that the leafcutter bees or bees that use the materials of that plant end up taking home with them whatever was sprayed onto the plant, and they use it in their nests. There's a bunch of people right now trying to figure out how much that impacts bee populations, but the answers are tentative at best at this point, but we don't think these things are good for bees. And I'm unaware of a list of preferred or safe herbicides at this time. If someone else knows of one, I'd like to hear about that too. The second half was, are there good alternative methods? You know, I honestly don't know. Yeah, I don't know a lot about how invasive plant removal and stuff should happen. Weedy plant removal happens. So I can't say for sure. Perhaps there's someone else on this that can speak to that a little bit, but I don't know for sure.
Thank you so much. All right, Juan Carlos, we've got a question for you, and that is, do you imagine a breeding population of jaguars in the US within the next 20 years?
I can imagine that, but I have a very vivid imagination. So I think it is technically possible, even in the narrowest sense of a breeding population is you've got one female and she's had a litter. So in that very narrow sense of the definition, I think, there is possibilities. There are records of females, like I said, in northern Sonora. So eventually one of them making across some of the remaining gaps in the border wall and into the US and eventually having cubs, that is doable. The broader question that I ask my colleagues usually when we're having these discussions is, what do we want? Do we want a performative, like, yay, we did it, we have a breeding female with cubs? Or do we really want to restore an iconic species that is especially symbolic for its capacity to dominate a vast landscape that needs to be connected and provide for a broader set of species? As much as I love jaguars, I love jaguars that they are protecting the bees, and they're protecting the habitat for the bees and the bats and the owls and the amphibians. I'm a huge amphibian fan, and so that's really what we want. And so we should focus on that. We should focus on recovering a large enough population of jaguars in the US that is connected to the remaining population in northern Sonora, so that there's constant genetic interchange and the effect of the jaguar on the landscape, on ecosystems, on rivers and bee populations and all of those other things is what we really want. And then we have a thriving landscape for everyone, including humans, and not just, yay, we did it, it's in the news, and, who knows where that will go. That I think is the larger question that I don't see happening in 20 years, but we're in this for the long game, and we're here to bring up new generations of conservationists that will take the torch and hopefully have better odds at protecting these species than our generation has.
Thank you. We are down to the final few minutes, so I have one overarching question that hopefully one or a few of you can answer, and that is, in the spirit of this both single species and landscapes topic, what do you see as the priority for all of these species across the landscape in the Southwest moving forward?
I can go first. Should I stop going first? Um, for me, and this might be my like personality and bias, but to me, I think the best thing that could happen for wild bees right now is science communication about who they are and how many are out there and where they're living, and getting people on board with thinking beyond the honeybee, so that when we start thinking about priorities on landscapes, we have framed our mind correctly and have the context that we need to ask and then try and answer the right questions.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll just quickly say that I think, yeah, for some of this like bigger picture stuff, at least for the state of Arizona, a whole third of that landscape is tribal lands. So not only recognizing like their sheer footprint and the capacity that they're beginning to build with managing their lands, but then also the social license that they can provide to their partners. So like, you know, in terms of just getting more work done on the ground, through fuels reduction projects and just building a more resilient forest ecosystem, I think tribes can be really significant partners in that effort.
I would say in all these, you know, education, as Olivia also pointed out, is extremely important both to the public and federal managers or any natural resource managers, as well as the public, on the importance of these systems and how they affect their lives. So that's important. And then in terms of the animal itself for bats, in the West, it's definitely just being creative and proactive in ways to maintain water on the landscape, and then also on the global side, doing what we need to do politically for climate change for the long term as a nation and global citizens. Because we could do a lot, but if we can't change that, then it's going to be, some of it will be outside of our control.
I agree on all of the points before, and I would add a significant gap in conservation of jaguars and other species that are shared between our countries is the gap in funding. A lot of philanthropy that occurs in the US stops at the border because the vision and the imagination stops at the border. It looks like, you know, that's there's a line drawn on a map and there be monsters south of this line. And that perception just stifles the imagination of the people with the financial power to make an impact on the landscape. There are huge capacity needs in Mexico. There's definitely not a strong and thriving conservation movement as there is in the US. It is much younger in Mexico. And it will need a lot of support to get to the point where we can be successful in protecting corridors for jaguars, continue to protect the breeding populations, and eventually establish a binational population for the species, you know, along with, you know, the political challenges that I mentioned just a minute ago.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here today. Sorry for keeping you over just a few minutes. I want to do one final plug for our final webinar in this series focused on communication to improve wildlife outcomes. Link is in the chat to register. It will be in 2 weeks. Again, thank you so much for being here, and I hope everyone has a lovely afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you for putting this together.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Great
much.
job.